I've fallen down a bit of a weird rabbit hole. While researching the game Pro Golfer Saru for the regular videos I produce for this channel, those document the complete libraries of Japanese game systems, I found out that there was another Pro Golfer Saru game, and that one had the dubious distinction of receiving the worst review scores ever from Famitsu magazine. And something like that is catnip for those of us who search out the weird and exotic in video games. So I got a copy of that Pro Golfer Saru, and then I found out that it wasn't the worst reviewed game in Famitsu magazine history. It shared that distinction with two other games. Naturally, I had to get them as well. And that brings me to the subject of this video, Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB. And while the game itself isn't much to look at, there's a lot going on around it. The first and most obvious question is, who is Famitsu, and why should I care about their reviews? Well, I can answer the first part of that, but I can't really give you a good answer to the second. Famitsu is Japan's biggest video game magazine. They've been running continuously since 1986, and they publish weekly. Naturally, one of their big features is their review section, and the format is unlike most other video game reviews. Rather than one person playing a game and writing up their thoughts in a big article, Famitsu has 4 people play, and they each do a short blurb with a few sentences, and give the game a score between 1 and 10. As far as I know, no game has ever received a score of 1 from any reviewer. People look at the total of those scores to get an idea of how well received the game was. In the case of Pro Golfer Saru, it received 3s across the board from all the reviewers. That's a total of 12, and no game has received a total less than 12. However, the other 2 games that received the total score of 12 also had at least one reviewer rate the game a 2. So is Pro Golfer Saru more consistently bad, or are the other 2 games more repulsive to some people? Well, we're going to explore that. Now, something you'll notice if you do a lot of diving into Famitsu reviews is that they tend to score games oddly. There's certain heavy biases in the magazine, so you'll come across a lot of games that score very highly in the magazine and make you ask, why? So a lot of beloved classics also wind up with some pretty middling review scores. But that just makes it more interesting to look back at these games that scored so poorly and go, is it really that bad? In the case of Pro Golfer Saru, my answer was no. It wasn't a great game, but its big sin was just not having any content in it and charging full price for the game. It's something that would have been a short mini-game in another release, and from that perspective it was actually kind of amusing. But I didn't have any hope for Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB as I went into it. It's a pachinko game after all, and those are rough to play at the best of times. But there's a lot going on with this one. And let's start with the developer and publisher, Nippon Telenet. It's possible that you might have heard of them before, because in the late 80s and early 90s, they had a brief moment where they were, well, let's not say big, but big fish in a small pond. They were one of the major developers for the PC Engine CD, in particular games like the Valis series and Cosmic Fantasy. But that heyday ended with the PC Engine, and Telenet struggled to break into any other platform. Telenet pivoted hard into Pachi-slot games. In fact, when they released Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB, and I have to keep using the full title because otherwise this will get even more confusing in a few minutes, it had been 3 years since Telenet released something that wasn't a Pachi-slot game. And it would be another 5 years before they released something that wasn't a Pachi-slot game. But hold on, you're saying. The title of the game says Pachinko, and you keep talking about Pachi-slot. Now that is its own story. To understand Pachi-slot and what was happening with Japanese gambling in 1998, let's jump backwards only a few years and talk about Pachinko. Pachinko was, and I am using the past tense here, Japan's national gambling pastime. They were electromechanical machines, though obviously I'm playing a video game version here for the ease of recording. You'd go into a Pachinko parlor, pay some cash to get a bucket of ball bearings, and then pour these into a machine. Usually there's a tray at the bottom. You'd launch the ball bearings into the machine, twisting a knob to adjust how much power they launch with, and then the balls would fall down through a pegboard. If you hit certain targets, then more ball bearings would come out. Eventually you run out of ball bearings, or you decide to quit, at which point you take anything that you have left, get it counted automatically by a machine, and then get your payout. Since gambling is illegal in Japan, despite there being a casino on literally every corner, you would get some small prize with no real value, and then you'd go next door where you would trade that prize for actual cash. That's the way it worked for a few decades, but in the early 90s, a new style of machine hit the market. And in this one, the only target that mattered was in the middle, which triggered a small video mode slot machine. Well, in the space of a few years, the pachinko part of pachinko machines got smaller and smaller, basically only remaining because of legal considerations, while those video slot portions got bigger and bigger, and those machines became known as Pachi-slot. In the space of 10 years, pachinko had been basically replaced by video slot machines. If you go to Japan now, you will struggle to find any traditional pachinko machine. They are effectively dead and gone. On the other hand, you won't be able to throw a rock without hitting a Pachi-slot machine. By the way, the cover of the pachinko game I've been playing looks like this. I just wanted to bring that up because it's one of my favorite ridiculous covers ever. So in 1998, things are pretty far along in the Pachi-slot transition. And Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB plays like an early Pachi-slot machine. There's a reason for this. It's because it's an early Pachi-slot machine. And that brings me to Irem. Irem as a video game publisher has had a lot of ups and downs. And in the late 90s, they were definitely in a down period. In the early 90s, they had a brief period of success with their new mascot, Genson, star of the Daiku no Genson series. Overseas, he was known as Hammer and Harry. And he's a carpenter with a big hammer who starred in a series of action games. But as the decade rolled on, and Irem started having trouble, they did what every Japanese game developer does in tough times: pivot to gambling. And so Genson wound up in a lot of Pachi-slot machines. In fact, there's more Genson Pachi-slot than there are other types of Genson games. There's an obvious reason for this. Right from the start, people recognized that the easiest way to attract someone to one of your video slot machines was to tie it to something familiar. That's where the CR comes from in Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB. It stands for character. Irem created this pachinko machine based on Genson. Obviously, this isn't the real one. Telenet created a video game version of it for the PlayStation, and it was bundled with a few other Pachi-slot machines as Parlor Pro. And as you'd often find in one of these transitional machines, there isn't a lot to it. You've got a couple of targets on the left and right that are especially difficult to sink a ball into, and the big video screen in the middle that will play an event when you get a ball into the bottom middle target. Now, it's hard to know if a Pachi-slot machine was successful. They're marketed towards those Japanese casinos, and even a machine that does really well will be cycled out within 6 months. That said, this machine must have been a pretty big success, because they are still making Genson Pachi-slot machines. If you go into a Pachi-slot parlor right now, there's a pretty good chance you'll find one. Or at least according to a machine tracker I found, which says they are installed at 1,800 locations across Japan. Yeah, Japan has a lot of casinos. And so, that first Genson Pachi-slot machine was ported to the Game Boy. And that's what Famitsu reviewed. The scores for Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB were 5, 2, 3, and 2. And honestly, that 5 is absurdly generous. Now obviously, I don't think very much of Pachinko or Pachi-slot. I'm not a gambler, and I don't like games where I have effectively no control over the outcome. But because I've been documenting system libraries, I've played plenty of just about every genre. And Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB is the worst Pachinko or Pachi-slot game I've ever played. I'm not going to say it's the worst ever. There's an awful lot of them out there, and somebody could have made something even worse. There's definitely enough people who dump out lazy garbage in this genre. But this is a game that won't even appeal to people who like Pachinko. It's the worst possible presentation, on a machine that doesn't really work, and it's not really set up for someone playing in their home, or I guess on the go if they took their Game Boy with them. I'm actually going to start with that last point because it's actually kind of important to gambling video games. I'm going to let you into a little secret here. If you go to a real casino, the odds in all of the games are stacked in the casino's favor. I know, it's a huge shock. That doesn't have to be the case with video games, and it often isn't. In a video game, you want the player to feel like a winner, and it's not like you have any overhead on that disc you popped into your PlayStation. So gambling video games are often weighted in the player's favor. Basically, it's to keep you going. Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB not only doesn't tilt the game toward the player, it's actually harder to get a payout on this than it is to get one on the real machine. Or at least the PlayStation simulation of the machine, but there's also some other things too. Look at that go on the left-hand side. There's only one possible path that a ball could take to even approach the pocket. And the pot below it, while the pins there are spaced so tightly, I don't even think the ball can reach it. The only way that you can get additional balls out of this Pachi-slot machine is through that slot machine in the middle. Basically, it's almost impossible to do anything here. I played for an hour and did not get a single ball out of the machine. And that kind of unbalanced play is already an issue, but then you take that to the game modes. There's a free mode where you just play pachinko. Who cares about that? And then there's a tournament mode, where you and 7 computer opponents compete to see who is the pachinko master. It's a single elimination tournament, complete with bracket, and none of that matters because the only place you ever see these people is on the screen to know who your next opponent is. And they have absolutely no effect on the game. They're also not characters from Genson for some reason. The only Daiku no Genson content here is Gen's appearance on the machine. Your opponents all have short profiles in the manual, but it's not like they have personalities. Your goal in the tournament is to score 2,000 balls before your opponent. As far as I can tell, there is no actual time limit here, and that's because the only way to get balls out of the machine is to win the slot machine. That will put you over the 2,000 balls, and if there is a time limit, well, you run out of your initial 500 balls long before you encounter that. Basically, you hit the jackpot, or you lose. So that's loads of fun. At least there's a battery save here, so you'll eventually win the tournament. Though why'd you keep going for that, I don't know. Beyond that, you might have noticed that I'm only getting one view of the playfield. Your view is locked in place even though the rest of the machine is simulated. You can't zoom out and get a better view. You can't scroll around. What you see is what you get. You also can't view or make adjustments to the pins. A big feature in pachinko video games is that you can take a close look at how the pins are tilted and adjust your aim based on that, though given the randomness here, I don't know how effective that really is. In some games, you can even adjust the pins yourself, or have the game randomize those pins for you. The pins here are locked in place, so there's not even that minuscule of difference between times that you play. There's only one machine, only one layout, only one position for all of the pins. You'll also notice that there's no music or sound effects except when the slot machine is running. The game is downright eerie that way. Now the one nice thing I can say is that they did manage to scale down the animations from the real machine to the Game Boy pretty well. When those big moments occur where you have 2 matching symbols up front, and then are waiting to see what the last one will be, you get a nice big view of the action. The other nice thing I have to say about Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB is that it's got a pretty nice background when you use a Super Game Boy. I'm playing this on a Super Game Boy 2, so you're seeing all of those pachinko balls fall at the correct speed. With such a simple game, there isn't much else to talk about, except of course the 2 big outstanding questions. Was the Famitsu score fair in placing this as one of the worst games of all time? And is it worth it to experience for yourself? For the Famitsu scores, I think they might be too generous. This is a bigger problem with Famitsu itself rather than these particular scores. Famitsu scoring is weirdly balanced. A game getting less than a 4 in those boxes is a significant event. So while Famitsu at least used to be hesitant to hand out the highest scores, although they've been a lot more generous in the past 20 years, they've also not really been willing to dip into the low end, even when it's justified. And so I think that one reviewer who gave this a 5 seriously overrated it. I personally don't think I would have given it a 1, but this is pretty bad. Of course, if you're watching this video, you're likely the kind of person who ran out and bought a copy of Superman 64. So is Pachinko CR Daiku no Genson GB bad in a way that becomes interesting? And really, no. This is a game that will put you to sleep even if you like Pachinko. This is bad in a way that's not engaging. I paid $16 for my copy of this game, but then I'm a weirdo collector who's chasing down all of the worst reviewed games. If you're not in that category, well, it's not even worth downloading the ROM.